Two things I didn't anticipate talking about when I made this channel were the COVID vaccine and suicide, but here we are. Suicide is a sensitive topic. I hope no one out there is thinking about it, but out of thousands, there are probably a few of you who are struggling with something. If you are, make sure that you talk to someone and keep on trucking. You'll pull through. Suicide is a subject, but in this particular case, I think it's a misdirection. I'm referring to the recreation video I did on the Cessna Citation 560 crash in Oregon a few years ago. Some of you commented on my video complaining about my conclusion, which was in line with the NTSB's probable cause of pilot incapacitation for indeterminate reasons, most likely a medical issue. It seems like there's a contingent out there who are confident that the crash was a result of a suicide attempt, which seems pretty unlikely to me. The evidence for a deliberate act, such as suicide, is thin, and where it does exist, contradictory. Now, I aim to be succinct with my recreation videos. I try to make them interesting and impactful, but this also means that there are a lot of details that I leave out. Sometimes there are other ways to read the evidence. If there's a reasonably likely alternative, I'll generally mention it. The far-flung speculative stuff I try to stay away from. You can't totally rule out a 1 in 100 chance event, but if you put it against a 95% probability, I'm probably not going to spend much time on it in my recreation videos. It breaks the flow to cram them with every conceivable possibility, but in these talking heads I can go into a little bit more detail. So keep the comments coming because I read them and I do think about them. The argument for suicide in the Citation crash has three pillars. The first was the fact that the pilot didn't take his dog with them on the accident flight. The second is an implication buried in the ADSB data that thrust was decreased to idle immediately preceding the final spiraling descent. And finally, that a series of bankruptcies provided the motivation for a suicide attempt. Let's start with the dog. Family and acquaintances of the pilot stated that he often traveled with his pet. This seems to have been in response to investigators' questions regarding the purpose of his flight, which was a relatively short hop from Oregon to Boise, Idaho. People who knew him stated that he had a habit of traveling with his pet when on business trips or vacations. For that reason, they surmised the flight to Boise was a day trip. The implication being that he would generally not take his dog along if it was going to be a quick turn for lunch and back. Now, there are two reasons why a dog not being on the plane doesn't add up to suicide. The first is the assumption that, if he didn't care enough about himself to live, he'd want his dog to survive nonetheless. Now, this isn't a gimme. People don't like being alone when they die. You could certainly imagine an animal lover wanting to protect their pet, but it's also not compelling evidence of suicidal intent. This is especially true with the seemingly normal explanation for the absence of the dog, that it was a day trip. A second leg of the suicide theme, and this one has good factual basis, is that thrust was reduced prior to the aircraft entering its fatal descent. Again, is this indicative of suicide? Do we see a pattern in suicide flights in which pilots reduce power prior to crashing into the ground? I mean, if you think about it, it's counterintuitive to want to slow the aircraft prior to driving it into the ground. The whole idea behind reducing thrust prior to descending is to avoid exceeding the maximum structural limit speed. In other words, reducing power in a descent is about survival, which is obviously not the sort of trait you'd expect to find in a suicidal person. Now, there are plenty of non-suicidal reasons why a pilot might want to descend prematurely. An emerging medical condition, for example. Suicide can't be ruled out here, but it's down the list of possibilities. And the third thing I came across was the idea that the pilot was a con man who was going broke. Now, I don't know much about the pilot himself. The research I do on these videos is intensive, but I have to draw boundaries somewhere or I'd never get anything done. So I don't spend much time investigating the background of the people involved. This leaves a moral question about who they are open, but that doesn't have any bearing on flight safety, which is the theme of the channel. I generally assume that they are well-intentioned individuals who, in some cases, made a fatal error. I don't see any upside in looking for a character deficiency to mitigate the discomfort that tragedy creates. Sometimes good people make mistakes and lose their lives. They didn't deserve to die. It can happen to any of us. Life is fickle. Now, that being said, hazardous attitudes exist, and they are a threat to the safety of flight. This particular pilot was clearly exhibiting a couple of those traits. He did not respect the authority of his instructor, who had obviously explained to him that he was not demonstrating the proficiency in the citation that was required for safe operation. The pilot also ignored the legal requirement to be properly certificated in the aircraft that he was operating. There's a bit of invulnerability here as well. He seemed impervious to his own limitations, which were on display in his inability to communicate effectively with air traffic control and in the sloppy flight path characteristics that he exhibited in the climb. Whether he was a moral person or not is, for our sake here, irrelevant. The question itself goes against the goal of flight safety, which is to encourage operating practices that are most likely to result in the desired outcome of survival. This doesn't make ethics pointless, it just means that morality is as important as it is overused. I've spent many hours in simulators with students who struggle for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they aren't as prepared as they should have been. Sometimes they're a little bit arrogant. Other times they're just having a hard time conceptualizing what they should be doing. In the end, I can either prop myself up on moral high ground and lecture them, or I can be useful. You can't do both. Now back to the suicide angle in the citation crash. The NTSB report briefly mentioned that the pilot was an entrepreneur with a history of several bankruptcies. They don't go into any other details regarding his financial status at the time of the accident, but I think that we can surmise a few things. The pilot had recently purchased the accident aircraft, a Citation 560, with the provision that new engines and avionics were installed. There are no details about the purchase price, but it had to have been well into seven figures. On top of this, he was operating the aircraft frequently with a pilot who he had hired to accompany him on trips, and he had completed 3 weeks of training in Phoenix for a type rating on the jet. The point is that he was dropping tens of thousands of dollars in operating expenses on the aircraft, not the type of thing that generally accompanies financial distress. The argument for suicide boils down to this: an absent dog with a perfectly benign explanation, a normal reduction of thrust prior to the initiation of an unexplained descent, and a handful of business bankruptcies which don't seem to have had a disruptive effect on the pilot's finances. There's another explanation, and the NTSB does a pretty good job of detailing it. They commissioned an aircraft performance analysis which determined that the aircraft demonstrated characteristics consistent with aerodynamic period oscillations. The technical term is phugoid. It's a tendency for an aircraft displaced from its trimmed airspeed to cycle in a waveform around its pitch axis. If an aircraft is trimmed for 250 knots and a displacement causes it to accelerate to 270 knots, the nose will naturally pitch back for 250 knots. It'll inevitably overshoot, slow below 250 knots, and then pitch back down. Each cycle will dampen the deviation, but the waveform will keep up for some time. And in the real world, some gust of wind or other phenomenon will inevitably create another deviation and start the cycle all over again. There are two very famous examples of this: the crash of Japan Airlines Flight 123 and United Airlines Flight 232. Both aircraft suffered the loss of all hydraulics, which rendered the flight controls unusable. Without any flight control inputs, both aircraft displayed phugoid flight paths. When a persistent phugoid is observed, it indicates an inactive elevator. In the case of the Citation crash, it doesn't seem likely that the inactive elevator was due to a mechanical failure. There were no communications throughout the 8-minute spiral descent to impact, which would be highly unusual in the event of a flight control malfunction. The phugoid pattern, along with the persistent spiraling descent, is a strong indicator of the absence of flight control inputs. I'm not aware of a case in which a suicidal pilot failed to input control forces during the suicide attempt. I'm in the middle of a small series on incapacitation. Most of you probably already watched a recreation of the accident of another Cessna 560 that was intercepted after overflying Washington, D.C. in the beginning of June. I did a talking head on that video, and some of you wondered about the absence of frosted windows in the aircraft during that event. I have a few things to say about that, but I wanted to start off by saying that I'm leaning towards the accident being the result of a medical event, but it's not that far from 50-50 between that and hypoxia. There are good arguments in either direction. As it relates to the lack of frosted windows, there are a few things to note. The first is that we do not have a comprehensive witness statement by the fighter pilots who intercepted the Citation. All that we have is media reports that the pilots witnessed the pilot slumped over, which of course indicates some form of incapacitation. It's possible that they saw frosted windows as well. We just don't know yet. And why would we equate frosted windows with depressurization? This goes back to the Payne-Stewart Learjet crash over South Dakota in 1999. The Learjet was intercepted by F-16s after it veered off course, very similar to the recent Citation crash. The fighter pilots in that case reported seeing condensation on the windows. The presence of condensation is evidence of depressurization, as the heated, compressed air in a cabin possesses more water content than the cold ambient air outside the aircraft. As a cabin depressurizes, it also cools. As long as there's enough moisture in the air, it will eventually condense. Effectively, what it does is to form a cloud inside the aircraft. Now, the key feature here is the presence of condensation, or frost, on the windows is a very good indicator of a particular form of depressurization, controlled depressurization. If you have a window blowout, it'll be uncontrolled, and ambient air will intermix with the cabin to clear condensation very quickly. And before you say that the F-16 pilot should have seen the missing window, you have to understand that they intercepted the aircraft only a couple of minutes before it began a spiral dive into Virginia. Most of this time would have been spent attempting to get the pilot's attention on the left side of the aircraft, the captain side, the pilot side. If a cabin window had blown out on the right side, it could have easily been missed. More likely than this is that the air was particularly dry that day. The phenomenon of condensation is mostly the result of the air inside the cabin cooling to the dew point temperature. If the air is dry, the dew point temperature might be lower than the temperature the cabin cools to as it depressurizes. And if it depressurizes due to a malfunctioning outflow valve, which limits cabin pressure by dumping air overboard, the air conditioning packs could still be supplying heated air to the cabin. And this happened in June. Air temperatures are generally pretty low in the mid-30s, but in the summer they're warmer, decreasing the odds that condensation will occur with cabin depressurization. The best argument against hypoxia is the fact that the aircraft was being operated single pilot. A medical event resulting in crew incapacitation is nearly impossible with 2 or more pilots on board, but obviously a very real possibility with only one. When both pilots are incapacitated in a crewed flight, it almost always comes down to depressurization and hypoxia. For now, it appears as though the passengers were never aware of their peril, either because they were unconscious or simply not alert to the 180-degree turn over Long Island or the abnormally long flight time. Again, we don't have the full transcript from the F-16 pilots, so we don't know if they ever made visual contact with the passengers. But in doing the recreation of the 560 crash, I was struck by how small the cabin in the Citation is. Sitting in the back row, you can almost breathe on the pilot. It's hard to envision that they didn't notice him slumped over, but it's not impossible. It's similarly difficult to imagine that they didn't notice F-16s shooting flares outside the windows. I don't have the details on the specific avionics and autopilot system this particular Citation was equipped with, but some flight management systems will enter into roll mode when the aircraft passes the final fix in the flight plan. In this mode, it'll attempt to maintain wings level without any consideration to heading. If the aircraft ran out of fuel, and the timing in this case is reasonable for that, one tank will generally run out before the other. Twin jets pull fuel from their respective wing tank, and so this will result in one engine flaming out before the other. The resulting asymmetric thrust will cause the aircraft to yaw. In roll mode, the autopilot will not attempt to return to a steady heading, only maintain wings level. This will initially result in a slow, flat turn. With the loss of half the aircraft's thrust, before long, the aircraft will lose airspeed and begin to descend. Most autopilots will disengage as the aircraft decelerates close to the stall speed. Once this happens, the yaw will cause the aircraft to roll into the dead engine, the lift vector of the wing will start pointing off vertical, and the spiraling descent will tighten and accelerate, exactly what seems to have happened here. At some point, the second engine might have flamed out, but once the spiral descent begins, the aircraft won't recover without pilot intervention. That's all to say that this was obviously an incapacitation event. We're just not totally sure whether it was due to a medical issue or hypoxia. And while the seeming lack of condensation reduces the odds of a rapid depressurization event, it doesn't eliminate it. Added to this, the pressurization system in the 80s vintage Citation is not highly automated. For those who think that it would be impossible for a professional pilot to fail to respond to an aircraft that wasn't properly pressurizing in the cabin, there's the example of Helios Airways Flight 522 in 1997, a Boeing 737 that crashed when both pilots failed to recognize or respond to pressurization alerts during a climb. Now, the captain had 17,000 hours of flying experience, and the first officer had 7,600. The crew misidentified the cabin altitude alert as being the result of an errant takeoff configuration warning. I'm going to do a recreation on this one too. It's pretty interesting. But the end result is that the pilots passed out somewhere between 20 and 30,000 feet, which was around the last time the controller communicated with the citation pilot in the event over DC. The Helios crash occurred with an experienced flight crew who had nearly 10,000 hours on the 737 between them. The citation pilot had 34,000 hours of total experience, but only a few hundred in the citation. I don't want to stake my fortune to hypoxia here. Again, I think a medical event is slightly more likely, but there are pointers for hypoxia, namely the seeming lack of awareness of the passengers. And finally, vaccines. My intention isn't to get political here, but this kind of falls into the broad category of how we process facts. I've become increasingly aware of a contingent of people who believe that any incapacitation event is a result of a medical trauma caused by the pilot's vaccination history, namely that the COVID vaccine is killing people en masse. The argument for anyone who doesn't buy that particular narrative is that they're credulous. The government's pulled the wool over their eyes. Now here's the thing. I don't put my trust in large institutions, government or otherwise. I do, however, know that I can count on certain institutions to act in their own best interests. Lawyers, for example. If there was even the slightest evidence of a massive biopharma with revenues to the moon producing a drug that was killing people, you would have a mountain of lawyers making a class action. And if the government wanted to get everyone vaccinated in a nefarious plot, they wouldn't release a list of adverse side effects, which is exactly what's happened with the COVID vaccine. That's all I'm going to say on this particular topic. Get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated, it doesn't matter to me, but the vaccination status of pilots is not causing medical events and crashes. I'm in a little bit of a busy phase for the rest of July, but my goal is to try to get at least one video out a week going forward. Some of you have offered suggestions, and I appreciate it. There are so many events out there that it can be hard to get to them all. Keep the comments coming, though. I appreciate it. And until next time, take care.